The Bermuda Triangle had long been a place of whispered legends and scientific skepticism. To some, it was an area of strange disappearances, lost ships, and eerie phenomena that defied explanation. To others, it was nothing more than a stretch of ocean with no more incidents than any other heavily traveled region. But for the crew of the research vessel Erebus, the truth would be something neither side could fully comprehend. Their mission was clear: gather data on the electromagnetic anomalies reported within the triangle. What they did not know was that they would become part of the mystery themselves. The Erebus was not a simple ship. Outfitted with cutting-edge sonar, deep-sea cameras, and experimental signal tracking devices, it was designed to find explanations for what many called supernatural. Dr. Malcolm Greaves, the project leader, had spent his career trying to prove that the Triangle was nothing more than a confluence of geological and atmospheric phenomena. His team, composed of engineers, marine biologists, and communication specialists, was a mix of skeptics and cautious believers. But belief would soon become irrelevant. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence. The ship's radio, previously filled with the static chatter of distant vessels, went dead as they passed the invisible boundary into the triangle. At first, the crew assumed it was simple interference, but even backup frequencies failed. The only sound that remained was the low hum of the Erebus slicing through the dark waves. A collective unease settled over the ship. Then came the fog, thick and unnatural. It rolled in as if it had been waiting for them, swallowing the ship whole. Visibility dropped to near zero, the ocean and sky becoming indistinguishable from one another. The ship's radar struggled to make sense of its surroundings, throwing back garbled, contradictory data. It was as though the Erebus had entered a space that rejected conventional physics. It was within this spectral fog that the first anomaly occurred. A distress signal crackled through the speakers. Impossible, given that their radio had been dead moments before. It was weak, broken by static, but a voice could be heard beneath the distortion. The coordinates it gave were not far from their current position, yet there were no records of any ship in distress in that area. More unsettling still, the signal bore a timestamp from 1947. Dr. Greaves ordered the crew to triangulate the source of the signal. Despite the risk, they had come to investigate anomalies, and this was precisely what they had been looking for. As they followed the transmission, the fog thinned just enough to reveal what lay ahead: a shipwreck floating upright on the water as though it had sunk in reverse. The name on its hull was faded but still legible: SS Langford, a vessel that had vanished without a trace nearly 80 years ago. The Erebus pulled alongside the ghost ship, and the team prepared to board. The metal of the Langford's hull was covered in patches of something that looked like rust, but pulsed faintly under the dim light. The air smelled of salt and something else, something organic but rotten in a way that defied identification. The crew exchanged wary glances before stepping onto the deck. Inside, time had not touched the ship as it should have. The corridors were damp, but there was no sign of decay. Tables were still set with dishes, half-eaten meals fossilized on their plates. Personal belongings were strewn across cabins, as if abandoned in haste. And yet, there were no signs of a struggle, no indication that the crew had been forced to leave. It was as though they had simply stopped existing. Then, the whispers began. At first, they seemed like the distant echoes of the Erebus's own crew moving through the ship, their voices distorted by the metal halls. But the words were wrong. Too many voices speaking at once, too many syllables for any known language. It was an unnatural chorus, growing louder the deeper they ventured inside. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating through the bones of the ship. One of the engineers, a woman named Riley, reached out to touch the rust-like patches on the wall. As soon as her fingers met the surface, the ship groaned, a deep and mournful sound, as though it were waking from a long slumber. A single phrase cut through the chaotic whispers, clear and undeniable. "You were not supposed to return." The Langford shifted beneath them, as though coming alive. The fog outside thickened again, and the ship's structure groaned like a dying beast. Whatever had happened to the Langford's crew, it had not simply been a disappearance. And now, The Erebus was no longer alone in the triangle. It was part of something much older, something that had been waiting. The silence that followed the whispered warning was more terrifying than the sound itself. The crew of the Erebus stood frozen in the dim corridors of the SS Langford, their breath shallow, their senses overwhelmed by the oppressive atmosphere. The ship groaned beneath them, as though it had been disturbed from a restless sleep. The rust-like patches on the walls pulsed faintly, a sickly glow that seemed to flicker in response to their presence. No one spoke, but the unspoken thought ran through their minds. They were not alone. Dr. Malcolm Greaves, ever the skeptic, tried to mask his unease. He turned to the team, his voice measured but strained. "We document what we can and return to the Erebus. There has to be an explanation for all of this." His words were meant to be reassuring, but even he knew they sounded hollow. There was no rational explanation for a ship, lost for nearly a century, floating in pristine condition in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle. As the team moved cautiously through the corridors, Riley, the engineer who had touched the pulsing metal, shuddered. "It feels like this ship is breathing," she muttered. No one responded. No one wanted to acknowledge that she might be right. The deeper they moved into the Langford, the more unnatural their surroundings became. The air grew heavier, charged with an electric tension that made their skin prickle. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting in ways that defied logic. Then, the radio on the Erebus crackled to life. The crew's handheld receivers, which had been silent since they entered the triangle, suddenly burst with static. At first, it was nothing but garbled noise, but then voices, distant, distorted, as though coming from a great depth. The words were indistinct at first, but soon a pattern emerged. "Erebus, do you copy? Langford lost time, don't follow." The voice was familiar, but impossibly so. It belonged to Captain Everett Cole, their own captain, the man who was currently waiting for them aboard the Erebus. The team exchanged panicked glances. How was this possible? Riley fumbled with her receiver, trying to respond. "Captain, we hear you. What's going on?" But the response was not what they expected. A second voice joined the first, a perfect mimicry of Riley's own. "Captain, we hear you," it repeated, an eerie distortion that sent a wave of dread through the crew. Then, a third voice layered itself over the others, and a fourth. Soon, the radio was filled with overlapping echoes of their own voices, each slightly out of sync, each warped by something that was trying to understand them. Then, the voices stopped. A single phrase remained, whispered from the depths of the static. "You should not be here." Panic set in. Dr. Greaves, his skepticism now crumbling, ordered the team to retreat. But as they turned back, the corridors seemed different. The layout of the ship had changed. The door they had entered through was no longer where they remembered it. The pathways twisted in ways that should have been impossible. The Langford was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a shifting labyrinth, and they were trapped inside it. The fog outside thickened again, curling in through unseen cracks in the ship's structure. The pulsing metal patches on the walls grew brighter, casting an otherworldly glow over the corridor. And then, from somewhere deep within the ship, they heard it, a slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps, but they were not alone in the Langford. Something else had been waiting, something that had learned their voices. And now it was coming. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and impossibly heavy, echoing through the corridors of the SS Langford with an unnatural weight. Each step sent vibrations through the metal floor, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to align with the eerie flickering of the rust-like patches on the walls. The crew of the Erebus stood frozen, their breath shallow, their eyes locked on the darkness ahead. No one moved. No one dared to. Dr. Malcolm Greaves clenched his fists, his rational mind warring with the rising panic clawing at his chest. "We need to move," he whispered, barely audible over the ship's groaning hull. "Now!" His voice was calm, but his hands trembled as he gestured for the team to retreat. Riley, the engineer, clutched her radio, eyes darting around as she whispered, "That doesn't sound human." No one disagreed. The weight of the footsteps, the way they seemed to stretch unnaturally through the corridors, bending time and space, it all defied logic. And yet, the sound was drawing closer. The team turned, moving quickly but carefully through the twisting corridors. Yet, no matter which way they went, the layout of the Langford kept changing. Hallways that should have led them back to the deck now ended in solid walls. Doors that had been opened just moments ago were suddenly welded shut, rusted over by the same pulsing patches that covered the ship's interior. The Langford was shifting, as though it were alive and unwilling to let them leave. Then came the voices again. At first, they were only whispers, indistinct murmurs seeping from the very walls of the ship. But as the footsteps grew closer, the whispers transformed into something worse. Echoes of the crew's own voices. Words they had spoken earlier repeated themselves in a garbled loop, fractured sentences playing over and over like a broken recording. "We need to move. Now." That doesn't sound human. No signs of struggle. Riley clamped a hand over her mouth, trying to suppress a whimper as she heard her own voice from somewhere ahead of them. No, this isn't possible." Then the lights flickered. Not just the team's flashlights, but the strange bioluminescent patches along the walls. For a split second, everything went dark, and in that fraction of a second, something moved. A shape, not quite human, not quite solid. A silhouette standing just beyond the edge of the light. And then a scream. It came from deeper within the ship, distant yet impossibly close. A sound so raw and inhuman that it sent an instinctive, primal terror through every member of the team. Dr. Greaves grabbed Riley's wrist and yanked her forward. "Move," he barked. The others didn't hesitate. They ran. The footsteps behind them quickened, no longer slow and deliberate but frenzied, matching their own movements, mimicking their own fear. The walls seemed to pulse in response, vibrating with an unseen energy, the rust-like patches now glowing a deep, sickly red. The Langford was no longer just a ghost ship, it was a trap. They rounded a corner, nearly stumbling as the floor beneath them shifted. And then, suddenly, they were outside. The fog that had once obscured the ship had lifted, revealing the deck of the Langford under a sky devoid of stars. The ocean surrounding them was black, not like water, but like a vast abyss stretching infinitely in every direction. There was no horizon, no sense of up or down, just nothingness. And in that nothingness, standing on the far end of the deck, was a figure. It had no face, no discernible features, just a shadow shaped like a man, standing impossibly still, watching them. And then, in a voice layered with the echoes of their own, it spoke. "You cannot leave." The words lingered in the air, heavier than the oppressive silence that followed. "You cannot leave." They were not spoken, but rather imprinted in their minds, like an invasive thought forced into existence. The figure on the far end of the deck remained still, its outline shifting slightly, as though the very fabric of its form was unraveling and reassembling at the same time. Dr. Greaves' breath came in short, frantic gasps. His rational mind screamed at him to explain what he was seeing, but there was no science here, no logic to anchor himself to. The Langford had defied every natural law since they had stepped aboard, and now they were face to face with something that should not be. Riley took a cautious step forward, her flashlight trembling in her grip. What are you?" Her voice was small, barely audible over the eerie stillness of the world around them. The figure didn't move, but the air around it rippled, like a heat wave distorting reality itself. Then it spoke again, but this time it was not in their voices. It was someone else. "Lost." The voice was cracked, layered, ancient. It was not a name, but a fate. The crew exchanged panicked glances. They were standing on the deck of a ship, yet the ocean around them was wrong. There were no waves, no wind, no scent of salt in the air. It was an absence, an abyss that stretched endlessly in every direction. Even their own reflections were missing from the surface. It wasn't water, it was void. Then, something broke the silence. A single ripple disturbed the abyss. It was slow, calculated, deliberate. Something beneath the surface was moving. The ripple expanded outward, vanishing into the infinite darkness. And then another, closer. Something was rising. Riley grabbed Dr. Greaves' sleeve, her nails digging into his arm. "We have to get off this ship," she whispered, her voice on the edge of hysteria. "Now!" The figure on the deck finally moved, not by stepping forward, but by dissolving. It unraveled into thin strands of black mist, each thread twisting unnaturally before evaporating into the air. It was gone, but its presence lingered, imprinted in their bones and their minds. The void below them shuddered, and the pulsing glow of the ship's metal veins seemed to synchronize with whatever lay beneath the surface. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural groan that resonated from beneath the abyss, an unfathomable voice speaking from the depths. It was not meant for them. It was not meant for anything human to hear. The air became heavy, pressing down on their chests. Dr. Greaves grabbed Riley and the others, his voice urgent. "Back inside. Now!" They sprinted toward the nearest hatch, the ship's unnatural shifting be damned. As they crossed the threshold, the last thing Riley saw before the door slammed shut was the abyss splitting open, something vast and wrong beginning to emerge. The Langford had trapped them, but now it was the only thing keeping them from what was coming. The moment the hatch slammed shut behind them, the sound of the abyss split the air like a tear in reality itself. A deep, resonant howl vibrated through the metal walls of the SS Langford, setting the rusted surfaces trembling. It was neither wind nor creature, but something older, something beyond human comprehension. The ship moaned in response, as if caught in an unseen grip, its structure bending and shifting with an unnatural will. Dr. Greaves pressed his back against the cold steel, his heart pounding. The others, Riley, Collins, and Torres, stood motionless, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. There was no mistaking what had happened. The void beneath them had moved, had stirred, had awoken. Riley was the first to break the silence, her voice hoarse. "Did you see that?" She swallowed hard, her hands still clenched into fists. That wasn't the ocean. That wasn't water at all. Collins wiped the sweat from his forehead, his breath shallow. "The figure," it said, "lost. Do you think it meant us?" His voice cracked on the last word. No one answered. No one wanted to. Then, without warning, the ship lurched. Not forward, not backward, downward. The floor tilted beneath them, sending them staggering against the walls. A sharp, metallic screech ripped through the air as the entire vessel descended, as though being pulled into the abyss below. Greaves grabbed onto a rusted pipe, his mind racing. This ship's been floating here for decades. Why is it sinking now? Torres struggled to keep his balance, his fingers digging into the corroded metal of the bulkhead. "Because something wants us below." A low, rhythmic thudding sound echoed from deep within the ship, like a heartbeat. A pulse. The same pulse that had been rippling through the walls since they arrived. But now it was stronger, closer. The Langford wasn't just falling, it was being dragged. Then came the voices. At first, they were only whispers, hissing through the corridors, seeping out from the vents, curling around the edges of reality like mist. But as the ship plunged deeper into whatever lay beneath, the voices became clearer. They were pleading, "Don't go down. It isn't dead. We should have burned the ship." The voices overlapped, tangled echoes from the past, warnings carried across time. Greaves clenched his jaw, his mind reeling. These weren't just sounds. These were fragments of something real, of people who had once stood where they stood now. The missing crew of the Langford? The last traces of their minds, their souls? The ship lurched again, faster this time. The metal groaned, twisting under unseen forces. Riley grabbed onto Collins, her breathing ragged. "We have to find a way off this thing right now." But there was nowhere to go. No lifeboats. No visible escape. The hatch they had entered through gone. Not closed. Not blocked. Gone. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and then they failed. The darkness swallowed them whole. And in that darkness, something breathed. The absence of light was absolute. It was not the kind of darkness the human eye could adjust to. There was no gradual unveiling of silhouettes. No faint glow from the emergency lamps. This was a void, thick and suffocating, pressing in on them like the unseen pressure of deep waters. And somewhere within it, something breathed. It wasn't human. The sound was slow, deliberate, a drawn-out inhale, as if something vast was tasting the air, savoring the scent of its new occupants. Then came the exhale, deep, resonant, carrying a faint vibration that rattled the steel walls of the Langford. The air itself felt warmer, thicker, wrong. Dr. Greaves squeezed his eyes shut, as if doing so would block out the suffocating presence all around them. His hands found the wall, fingers dragging along rusted metal in search of anything. A light switch, a vent, a way out. "Riley? Collins?" His voice was barely above a whisper. No response. A cold dread coiled in his gut. They had been standing right next to him just moments ago. His mind raced. Had they moved? Had something taken them? Then a whisper slithered through the air. "Greaves, over here." It was Riley's voice. But something was off. It was stretched, elongated, like a recording played at the wrong speed. His instincts screamed at him not to move, not to trust the voice, but he had no choice. Stumbling forward, he extended his hands blindly, searching for anything in the oppressive darkness. His fingers brushed against something. Not metal, not fabric, skin, but it wasn't Riley. The texture was wrong. Cold, rough, yet slightly damp, like flesh preserved too long in seawater. Greaves yanked his hand back, his breath catching in his throat. The thing in front of him moved, shifting slightly in the dark, and he heard it inhale again. Deep, wet, slow. Then the lights flickered back on. For a single horrifying instant, Greaves saw it. It was standing where Riley should have been, tall, skeletal, stretched beyond the proportions of anything human. Its face was a mess of sagging, translucent skin, its eyes sunken deep within its skull, and its mouth was full of teeth that did not belong. Greaves staggered back, tripping over Collins, who was sprawled on the floor, dazed but alive. Riley was next to him, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Torres was farther down the corridor, gripping a crowbar, ready to strike. The thing tilted its head, as if studying them. Then it opened its mouth, far too wide, and let out a sound. A scream, not its own, but a chorus of screams. Hundreds, maybe thousands, male and female, young and old. Agonized voices echoing out of its throat as if they had been swallowed whole. Greaves scrambled to his feet. "Run!" The lights died again, plunging them back into the void. And in that suffocating darkness, the breathing came closer. The darkness swallowed them whole once more, and with it came a silence so dense it felt like a physical force pressing down on their lungs. Dr. Greaves ran blindly, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His feet stumbled against the rusted metal floor, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Somewhere behind him, the thing breathed, inhaling the scent of its prey. Riley was ahead of him, her footsteps rapid but uneven, her breathing ragged. Collins was close behind, his voice rasping in the dark. "Where's Torres?" Greaves nearly answered, but the sound of wet footsteps in the corridor ahead froze the words in his throat. Something was moving toward them from the opposite direction. Then a voice. Not from behind them, not from ahead, from the walls. "Don't turn around." It was Collins' voice. Greaves felt his stomach twist. That wasn't possible. Collins was right behind him. He could hear him running, hear his breathless gasps. And yet, the voice in the walls was Collins. The same timbre, the same fear barely contained beneath the words. Then came another voice. "Riley, don't stop running, please." It was Riley's voice, but Riley was ahead of them. Greaves clenched his teeth, his mind fighting against the creeping horror that slithered into his thoughts. The ship was playing with them. No, not the ship. The thing inside it. The thing that had taken the crew of the Langford decades ago. Torres suddenly screamed, a short, sharp cry that ended in a gurgling choke. Greaves and Riley skidded to a stop, their bodies frozen in the pitch-black corridor. "Torres?" Greaves shouted, his voice bouncing through the empty space. No response, only the breathing. And then, the lights flickered again. For a split second, Greaves caught a glimpse of Torres hanging upside down from the ceiling, his body wrapped in something black and pulsating, his face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. Then the lights died again. A sharp, wet tearing sound filled the corridor, and Torres was gone. Riley let out a strangled sob, clamping a hand over her mouth. Collins pressed his back against the wall, his eyes wide, his body trembling. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Then the ship itself shuddered, a deep groan of metal and rust echoing through its hollow corridors. Greaves steadied himself, feeling something shift beneath his feet. Not the floor, but the space itself. "We're not just sinking," he whispered. "We're being pulled." Collins exhaled shakily. "Pulled where?" Greaves swallowed, staring into the darkness. The answer sat like a weight in his chest, unspoken but understood. Not down, not deeper into the ocean. They were being pulled somewhere else. The ship was no longer a ship, at least not in the way Dr. Greaves understood. The moment Torres vanished, something in the air changed, thicker, heavier, saturated with a damp heat that clung to their skin like sweat. It smelled wrong, organic, as if the Langford was no longer just decaying metal, but something alive. A deep, guttural groan echoed through the corridors, rattling the walls and the rusted pipes above them. Greaves clenched his jaw, realizing the horrifying truth. The ship was shifting. The very architecture was warping, corridors stretching in impossible directions, doorways shifting like the joints of a living creature. They were inside something that was changing around them. "We can't stay here." Riley's voice cut through the suffocating tension. She wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Collins, still visibly shaken, ran a trembling hand over his face, his eyes darting between the darkened corridors like a trapped animal. Greaves inhaled, forcing his mind to function. "We need to get back to the deck. We find a way out, or—" A sudden thump reverberated through the metal floor beneath them. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. Greaves turned his head slowly, his ears straining. The noise hadn't come from behind them, or ahead. It had come from below. The ship groaned again, this time more visceral, more unnatural. A distant sound followed, something wet, something shifting like flesh being pulled apart. Then the walls breathed. It started as a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. The metal bulkheads along the corridor seemed to pulse. The rivets and rusted seams stretching outward as if filled with lungs. The grooved steel bent and flexed in slow undulations, inhaling, exhaling. The ship was alive. Collins stumbled back, his voice strangled. "Jesus Christ, this isn't happening." Riley pressed herself against the opposite wall, her hands trembling. "What the hell is this place?" Greaves wanted to answer, but the truth was too large, too impossible. The USS Langford had been swallowed by the Bermuda Triangle over 50 years ago. But now, standing in this shifting, breathing labyrinth, it was clear the Langford had not been lost at sea. It had been consumed, and now it was digesting them. A sudden, sharp gasp tore through the air. It came from farther down the corridor, a voice, a human voice. "Help, please, someone." Greaves' pulse hammered. He turned toward the source, scanning the dimly lit hallway. "Did you hear that?" Riley nodded, her eyes wide. It sounded, "Help me. Oh God, please." The voice was closer now, ragged, desperate. Collins swallowed. "That's Torres." Greaves felt ice crawl up his spine. No, that wasn't possible. They had seen what happened to Torres. "Torres is gone," he whispered. But the voice came again, raw and agonized. "Don't leave me here." Greaves exhaled. His instincts screamed at him to run, to ignore the impossible voice calling out from the pulsing corridor. But a deeper, unshakable terror slithered into his mind. If Torres was gone, then who the hell was speaking in his voice? Dr. Greaves clenched his fists, feeling the walls of the Langford tighten around them, the rhythmic pulse of metal contracting like lungs on all sides. The ship, or whatever it had become, was aware of them. It had been shifting, rearranging itself in slow, deliberate movements, making it impossible to navigate back the way they came. Now, a familiar voice was calling them deeper inside, luring them with a terrible familiarity. "Help me, don't leave me here." Torres' voice. But not Torres. Riley gritted her teeth, shaking her head. That's not him. Her voice was strained, almost panicked. She turned to Greaves, her expression pleading. "You know it's not him, right?" Collins, however, looked less convinced. He swallowed hard, his face pale. "What if it is?" His voice wavered. What if we left him behind? And now he's gone?" Greaves said sharply. "You saw what happened." Collins flinched, looking away, but the voice continued. "Collins, please. I don't want to die alone." The moment it said his name, Collins sucked in a sharp breath. His eyes darted to the others, then back toward the dark corridor ahead. His body shifted forward, an unconscious step toward the sound. Greaves reached out and grabbed his arm. "It's not him." Collins yanked away, his breathing ragged. "You don't know that?" His hands clenched into fists, his body vibrating with indecision. The voice sounded so human, so agonized, but it was wrong. Greaves could feel it in his bones. Then, the ship shuddered again. The walls flexed, and the voice changed. It wasn't Torres anymore. It was Greaves. "Please help me. Don't leave me here." The blood drained from Greaves' face. His own voice had been thrown back at him, perfectly replicated, filled with fear, with weakness. The ship was playing with them, mimicking what it had consumed. The moment that realization sank in, the voice shifted again. "Riley, please, it's so dark." Riley's body stiffened. Her fingers dug into her own arms, shaking. "Shut up," she whispered. "Shut up. Shut up." Collins took another unsteady step toward the corridor. His head was tilted slightly, like he was listening for something deeper within the sound. What if they're trapped? His voice was hoarse, his rationality slipping. What if they're... Then all at once, the voice stopped. The silence was worse. Greaves exhaled slowly. The ship had spoken in their voices. It had whispered their names. It had tried to draw them closer. And now it was waiting. The realization settled in his stomach like a stone. They weren't just lost inside the Langford. They were being hunted. The corridors of the Langford had become a maze, but it was not a maze of metal and rust anymore. As Dr. Greaves stumbled through the darkened hallways, the walls felt closer, like they were breathing in time with his movements. His senses screamed at him to turn around, to leave, but the ship was no longer just a vessel. It had become something else, something alive. The walls pulsed like veins, and the air was thick with the weight of a presence that wasn't entirely physical. They had been walking for hours, or perhaps longer. Time was as distorted here as everything else. The passageways seemed to twist, to shift their positions when they weren't looking, and the faint hum of machinery had faded entirely, replaced by an eerie quiet that was only broken by their ragged breathing. Greaves was certain now. The ship wasn't just consuming them. It was feeding on them. Behind him, Collins' steps faltered. His breathing was shallow, almost labored. "It's changing again?" His voice was taut with panic. He was looking at the walls as though he could see something they couldn't. Riley, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "What is it, Collins? What do you see?" He shook his head, his eyes wide, his pupils dilated with fear. "I don't know. It's like it's turning into flesh." Greaves froze, his gaze snapping to the walls. For a split second, he thought he had seen a flicker, something that resembled skin, soft, warm, and moist, beneath the metal surface. The flesh of the ship was beginning to bleed into its structure. He had seen this before. Not here, not on the Langford, but in the records, in the whispered stories of the first explorers who entered the Bermuda Triangle. Tales of ships and planes that vanished, only to return years later with rotted flesh in place of their metal exteriors. It was a phenomenon so bizarre that even the most seasoned researchers had dismissed it as myth. But now, Greaves understood, the Bermuda Triangle was not just a place of disappearance. It was a place of transformation, a place where vessels didn't just sink or vanish. They were reborn, and not in any form that could be recognized as human or natural. They became something other. He felt his stomach turn. "We need to get out. We need to find an escape." But as he spoke, The walls around them gave a low, reverberating hum, almost like a moan. Greaves stopped walking. The sound was familiar. It was not mechanical. It was the kind of sound the human body made when in pain. And then the walls shifted, not in the slow, disjointed fashion they had come to expect. This time, it was violent, a great tearing, as if the ship itself was ripping apart. The corridor ahead of them twisted and buckled, then suddenly expanded, opening into a vast space that had not been there moments before. It was a chamber unlike anything Greaves had seen, a hollow, cavernous room filled with what looked like a sickening growth. Flesh, organic, pulsating, and grotesque. The walls were no longer solid metal, but a grotesque mesh of veins, tendons, and sinew. The floor was slick with something black and viscous, an ooze that seemed to move of its own accord alive. And in the center of it all was a figure. It stood motionless, its back to them, clothed in torn remnants of what once might have been a uniform. The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by a hood or perhaps a mass of dark, tangled hair. But Greaves felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He knew that face. It was Torres, or at least what was left of him. The skin had been stretched tight across his bones, his eyes glazed and vacant, as though all light had been drained from him. His mouth was open, but no sound came out, only the low hum of the ship's flesh pulsing around them. He took a step toward them, his movements stiff and jerky, like he was being controlled by some unseen force. What would happen to him? Riley whispered, her voice barely audible. Greaves didn't answer. He couldn't. There was no answer. Only the overwhelming scent of rot that filled the air. The thing that had once been Torres, was a receptacle now, a part of the ship, a part of whatever creature it had become. The truth was clearer now than ever before. The Bermuda Triangle was no longer a place of mystery. It was a hunting ground, and the Langford was its prey. And Greaves, Riley, and Collins had just become part of its harvest. The scene in the grotesque chamber left them frozen, their bodies heavy with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Torres, or what had once been Torres, stood at the center of the twisted, fleshy room, his presence a haunting reminder of the ship's insatiable hunger. The walls around them pulsated with a life of their own, like the ship itself was breathing, and the air felt thick with the stench of decay. Every step they took felt like it resonated through the very core of the ship, each movement echoing off the organic mass surrounding them. For a long moment, no one moved. Greaves was the first to break the silence. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. This is not just a ship anymore. It's something alive, something that's changing. He ran a shaky hand through his hair, trying to process what was happening, but the image of Torres, or the thing wearing his face, was burned into his mind. Riley stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief. But how? How is this possible? Her voice cracked as she spoke, the words almost too much to comprehend. How is any of this happening? Greaves swallowed hard, trying to find an explanation. But there were no answers, only questions. The ship, the Bermuda Triangle, Torres, everything was warped beyond recognition. The theories they had all studied, the hypotheses they had speculated, meant nothing now. They were trapped in a nightmare that defied all understanding, and the rules of reality were slipping away with each passing moment. Collins, still staring at the figure in the center of the room, took a cautious step forward. "It's calling us," he said quietly, as if the words were not his own. "The ship. It wants us?" Greaves turned to him sharply. "No, it doesn't want us. It wants to consume us. That's what it's been doing from the start. It's been using us, using our memories, our fears, our weaknesses to lure us in." The realization was suffocating. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was an entity, something ancient, something that had learned to feed on the human psyche. And it wasn't just collecting them, it was turning them into part of itself. The ship's form was no longer confined to its hull. It was reaching into their very souls, manipulating their perceptions, and twisting them into grotesque reflections of their worst nightmares. The figure of Torres twitched, and for a moment, Greaves thought it was about to speak. But instead, it collapsed to the floor, the limbs contorting unnaturally as if the flesh was fighting against the very form it had been given. Greaves winced, but he didn't look away. There was no mercy to be found here. Not for them, and certainly not for Torres. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The floor buckled and cracked, and the walls began to shift again, the flesh of the ship bulging outward as though something massive was moving inside. The air grew thick with a low, resonating hum, vibrating through their bodies like a pulse. "We need to move," Greaves said urgently. He grabbed Riley by the arm, pulling her toward the now widening doorway at the far end of the room. Collins hesitated, looking at Torres' twisted body one last time before following them. But they didn't have time to mourn. The ship was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing thing, and they were its prey. As they ran through the increasingly erratic corridors, Greaves couldn't help but wonder where the line between the ship and its victims had blurred. Had Torres ever truly been human? Or had he, too, become part of the creature long before they even arrived? Were they being tested? Was there some greater force at work here? Something behind the Bermuda Triangle itself? Riley suddenly stopped in her tracks, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She pointed to the walls ahead, her hand trembling. "Look at this," she said in a low, hoarse voice. It's us." Greaves turned to see what she meant. The walls of the corridor were covered in images, distorted, warped reflections of themselves. The faces of Riley, Collins, and Greaves stared back at them, twisted, screaming silently. Their bodies were not quite human. Arms and limbs stretched out in unnatural ways, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and agony. The ship had been watching them, and now it was showing them what it had already claimed. Collins backed away, his eyes wild. "This is it, isn't it?" he whispered. "We're already gone. We've been part of this thing the whole time. We just haven't realized it yet." Greaves clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. He didn't have the luxury of despair, not yet. He had to fight, had to survive. But the truth was sinking in. This wasn't just a survival mission anymore. This was a race against something that had no intention of letting them escape. And in that moment, as the walls closed in around them and the ship's pulse grew louder, Greaves realized that the heart of the void wasn't just the Bermuda Triangle. It was the ship, it was the creature, and it was their fate. All of it was a single, endless cycle of hunger. The ship was not after their bodies. It wanted something far darker, far more insidious. It wanted their souls. The ship groaned as if in pain, its structure shifting and convulsing beneath their feet. Every step they took felt heavier, as though the very air was thickening, pushing against them. Greaves, Riley, and Collins continued to move through the labyrinthine halls of the creature ship. But the more they walked, the more it felt as though they were walking in circles. There was no direction, no way forward or backward. Only the twisted corridors, the pulsating walls, and the constant, suffocating hum that vibrated through their bones. It wasn't long before Greaves realized they weren't alone. The ship had begun to whisper. It wasn't audible in the way voices should be, but it was undeniable. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like the brushing of 1,000 invisible hands against the walls, against their skin. The voices were becoming clearer now, too, more distinct. They heard names, familiar names. It was as though the ship had learned them, had absorbed them over time. They weren't just hearing voices. They were hearing memories. The echoes of the people who had come before them. They were all trapped here now, prisoners of the ship's hunger. Riley stumbled, her hand pressed against the wall for support. This is all wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. It's like we're in the middle of a nightmare we can't wake up from." Greaves didn't respond. He couldn't. He was too focused on the horrific truth that was unfolding before them. The ship had begun to transform. It was no longer simply a living being. It was now a sentient entity capable of creating and manipulating memories. They were not just on the ship anymore. They were inside it, inside the very mind of the creature. It was shaping their reality, bending their perceptions, and feeding on their fear. As they continued down the corridor, the walls began to shift again, this time revealing a large, open space. The room was unlike anything they had encountered before. The floor was covered in a slick, wet substance, and the air smelled of rot and decay. In the center of the room stood a massive, twisted figure. It was humanoid in shape, but the proportions were wrong, too elongated, too deformed. Its body seemed to ripple, constantly shifting, like liquid being poured into a mold. But what truly caught their attention were the eyes. Countless eyes, all watching them, all staring, seeing through them. Riley gasped, taking a step back. What is that?" Greaves couldn't bring himself to answer. He didn't need to. They all knew what it was: the core, the heart of the ship, the source of its power, its hunger, its madness. This was no longer a simple vessel lost at sea. It was a creature, a being that had consumed everything around it, and now it was feeding on them. Collins stepped forward cautiously, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to destroy it. Whatever this thing is, we can't let it keep going. If we don't..." He didn't finish the sentence. The room suddenly shifted, the walls contorting and closing in on them. The floor began to separate, cracks opening wide enough to reveal the dark abyss beneath them. The eyes of the twisted figure blinked, and the room grew colder. An unnatural chill settled over them, sending shivers down their spines. The whispers grew louder, now indistinguishable from the voices of their own thoughts. It was then that they realized the true horror. They were not in danger of being killed by the creature. They were in danger of being absorbed into it. Their bodies, their minds, their very souls were the prey, and the ship was the predator, continuously feeding and growing stronger. Greaves turned to Riley and Collins, his eyes wide with realization. "We need to go. Now, before it's too late." But as they turned to flee, the door they had entered through slammed shut, the walls locking them in. The room, which had once been a simple chamber, now seemed to pulse with life. The creature, or whatever it had become, was closing in around them, its eyes narrowing in hunger. It was no longer just a ship. It was a living, breathing entity, and they were its prey. The walls shifted again, and this time they weren't just changing. They were growing, stretching out like tendrils, reaching toward them with a force that felt as though it could swallow them whole. Greaves could feel the ship's pulse quickening, its energy focusing in on them like a laser. He grabbed Riley's hand, pulling her back as Collins began to shout, but the words were lost to the overwhelming sound of the ship's hum. And then a voice, a deep, guttural voice, spoke. It wasn't in any language they recognized. It was not a voice at all, really, but a thought, a presence, an idea. The ship wasn't speaking to them directly. It was filling their minds with its message, forcing them to hear it, to understand it. "You are mine now," the voice whispered, its tone drenched in malice. "You will never leave. You will become part of me." The room trembled, and the walls began to close in on them again, the darkness swallowing everything. Greaves's heart raced as he searched desperately for an escape, but the ship was not going to let them go. They had come too far, crossed too many lines. It had already claimed their minds, their souls. They were no longer just victims. They were its creations, its servants, part of its growing hunger. The ship was no longer a mystery to solve. It was their final destination, the end of the line, and they were just another chapter in its endless, insatiable story. Greaves awoke in darkness, a sensation he had become all too familiar with. The pulse of the ship still hummed beneath him, a constant, oppressive force that seemed to press against his very soul. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if they were bound by invisible chains. His body refused to obey him, a prisoner of the ship's will. His thoughts, too, seemed sluggish, as if they were being dragged through thick fog. But amidst the suffocating weight of the silence and the dark, one thought cut through. They were not alone. Riley was there, somewhere near him, her breath shallow but steady. He could hear it before he could see anything, soft, rhythmic, almost comforting in its consistency. Her presence brought him a small measure of hope, but even as he clung to that, a growing realization settled over him. They had not escaped. The ship hadn't simply captured them physically. It had trapped their minds within its endless maze. They were in its web, lost and bound together, as much a part of the ship as the walls themselves. The walls, he thought, were breathing. The walls, if that was even what they were now, were pulsing in response to their every move, watching, listening. Riley's voice cut through the stillness, weak but unmistakable. "Greaves, where are we? What's happening?" He couldn't answer immediately. The question itself was too vast, too impossible to answer. Where were they? Where had they ever been? The ship no longer resembled a traditional vessel. It had evolved, taking on forms that defied logic. There were no longer simple rooms or corridors. The ship had become a living organism, constantly shifting and changing its configuration, adapting and evolving as it absorbed more and more of their essence. "I don't know," he replied finally, his voice hoarse. He tried to push himself up but collapsed again, his body betraying him at every turn. "But I know we can't stay here. We need to move." Greaves's words felt hollow, even to him. They were trapped inside a beast whose very existence was an enigma. The deeper they went, the more their minds were assaulted, clouded by a relentless flood of images and thoughts that weren't their own. The ship had become a reflection of their fears, their doubts, their broken pasts. The deeper they journeyed into the belly of the beast, the more they began to lose their grip on what was real and what was illusion. The walls around them seemed to ripple in response to their confusion, as if the ship could taste their unease. The more they resisted, the more the ship tightened its hold on them. Memories began to emerge in flashes, fragmented and surreal. Greaves saw himself, or what appeared to be himself, standing on the deck of the ship, gazing into the vast emptiness of the Bermuda Triangle. He saw flashes of his crew, their faces twisted in terror, but no sound reached him. He saw Riley, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, but the image dissolved into mist before he could reach her. But then, something began to change. The air thickened, suffocating them as the walls continued their slow, pulsating rhythm. And then nothing. No sound, no pulse. Complete silence. Riley's voice again broke the eerie stillness, though her words were uncertain. "Greaves, do you feel that?" For the first time in what seemed like forever, Greaves felt the ship's presence recede. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the briefest of moments, the air felt normal again. The ship was still there, still present, but something had shifted. They were no longer being suffocated. The walls no longer seemed to pulse in their direction. The hum of the ship, once a constant vibration, had faded into the background, a low whisper at best. It was almost as if the ship had stopped watching them. Almost. Greaves hesitated, unsure if it was real or just another trick of the ship's will. But the strange quiet allowed for one thing, thought. He could think again, without the ship's manipulation clouding his mind. His thoughts became his own. "We have to move," he repeated, this time more determined. But as he stood up, his legs still unsteady, Riley's words stopped him. "I don't think it's that simple, Greaves." Her voice was steady now, but there was a tone of finality in it. "What if we've already gone too far? What if there's no going back?" The idea shook Greaves to his core. What if they had already passed the point of no return? What if their journey through the Bermuda Triangle, this uncharted, cursed territory, had already sealed their fate? What if they had fallen into a trap from which there was no escape? He couldn't let that thought linger. He couldn't allow it to take hold. Not yet. There had to be something they could do. They were still alive, still breathing, still fighting. But Riley's words had planted a seed. They weren't just fighting against the ship anymore. They were fighting against themselves, too. Against the very memories and fears the ship had learned to exploit. As they moved forward, the ship seemed to respond, drawing them further into its grip. It had become more than just a machine. It was a creature of despair, feeding on the essence of those who entered its domain. Greaves gripped the wall for support as he looked to Riley. "We're not dead yet, and I'm not going to let this ship have us." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into something he couldn't comprehend. The ship was not just a place. It was a test of their will, of their ability to resist. But it was also something more insidious. It was alive, and it was learning from them, adapting to their weaknesses. Each twist of the labyrinthine halls, each turn they made, only seemed to draw them closer to the heart of its hunger. The silence had returned, but it was no longer a reprieve. It was the calm before the storm, and they were running out of time. As the silence enveloped them, Greaves and Riley moved cautiously through the labyrinthine corridors of the ship. The once familiar sounds of the engine's hum had faded into an eerie stillness that seemed to swallow any noise they made. The walls around them, once metallic and cold, now seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Every turn they made revealed more of the ship's disorienting, ever-shifting nature. The corridors twisted and stretched impossibly, leading them deeper into its heart. Greaves felt as if they were walking in a dream. No matter how many times they turned, no matter how many passages they crossed, they could not find an exit. The ship had become a twisted reflection of their minds, its shape shifting with every thought, every memory, every fear. It was as though the very walls themselves were alive, responding to the deep, subconscious dread that they both shared. The ship was not just a vessel. It was an extension of their darkest thoughts. "I don't know where we're going," Riley said, her voice breaking through the fog of uncertainty that had settled over them. Her words seemed to echo back to them in distorted fragments, as if the ship itself were mocking them. "Do you think there's an end to this? Or is it just endless?" Greaves paused, his hand resting on the cold metal of the wall as he processed her words. They had both felt it, the sense that no matter how far they ventured, there was no escape. It was as if the ship itself had bound them within its eternal maze, each path leading only to another dead end. They were running in circles, both figuratively and literally, trapped in a cycle of confusion and despair. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't stop. We have to keep moving, no matter what." They pressed on, their footsteps hollow in the silence. Every few paces, Greaves glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the ship's walls closing in on them. But instead of a physical trap, he began to feel the oppressive weight of something far more subtle. The walls seemed to echo his thoughts, as if the ship was aware of their every hesitation, every doubt. And in response, it became more aggressive, more overwhelming, as though it were learning from their fear and using it against them. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and Greaves couldn't help but shiver. He noticed that Riley had pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, her face pale. The darkness of the ship seemed to seep into their very bones. It was not just the physical cold that was affecting them. It was the chill of the unknown, the sensation of being in a place that defied all logic and reason. Riley stopped suddenly, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice strained. Greaves strained his ears, trying to make sense of the faint sound that seemed to be growing louder. At first, it was little more than a whisper, a low murmur that echoed through the halls. But soon, it became clearer, sharper, until it was unmistakable voices. The voices were distorted, as though they were coming from miles away or from the depths of the ship itself. Greaves couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, frantic. His heart raced as the realization struck him. They weren't alone. The ship, this monstrous creation, wasn't just feeding on their fear. It was feeding on the fear of others. "Where is that coming from?" Riley whispered, her voice trembling as she strained to hear. Greaves didn't answer. He couldn't. The voices were becoming more insistent, as though they were calling to them, urging them to come closer. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching unease, but he couldn't resist the pull. He began to move towards the sound, his legs moving before his mind had a chance to protest. Riley hesitated, but then followed. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on them from all sides. The ship's walls began to warp and shift again, becoming more fluid, more organic. The harsh, metallic edges had softened, and the walls now seemed to breathe in rhythm with the voices. It was as though they were walking inside the heart of the ship itself, each step bringing them closer to whatever nightmare awaited. Suddenly, the corridor opened up into a large, cavernous chamber. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickly glow, casting eerie shadows across the room. At the center of the chamber, a pool of liquid rippled, glowing faintly with a bioluminescent light. And in the center of the pool, an object floated, its shape hard to make out. The voices were louder now, rising to a deafening crescendo. They seemed to be coming from the pool, from the object at its center. Greaves and Riley both froze, their gazes fixed on the glowing form. It seemed to pulse in time with the ship's strange rhythm, as if it were alive, its very presence an invitation, a temptation to come closer. "What is it?" Riley whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of voices. Greaves didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing. It looked like a crystal, but the shape was too distorted, too alien. It was as though it was constantly shifting, its form changing with every blink, every thought. It was the object of the ship's obsession, the thing that had lured them deeper into its grasp. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that whatever it was not meant for them. It had drawn them here on purpose. It had been waiting for them all along. But as they took another step closer, something shifted. The voices began to scream, no longer pleading for help, but now shrieking in terror. The ship's walls began to close in around them once more, the labyrinth tightening, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. They had made a terrible mistake. The pulsating glow of the crystal was like a beacon, an irresistible force drawing Greaves and Riley closer despite the mounting dread that surged within them. It was as though the ship itself was aware of their every movement, its architecture shifting and closing in on them as they approached the center of the chamber. The voices, once indistinct murmurs, had now become an overwhelming cacophony, each whisper and cry bending the very air around them. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a tangible force that seemed to distort the reality of the ship itself. Greaves felt a sudden and intense pressure on his chest, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. He reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against Riley's. She seemed just as affected, her face pale, eyes wide with fear and confusion. Despite their shared terror, neither of them could pull away. They were tethered to the ship, bound by its will, as if it had already decided their fate. "What is happening?" Riley's voice was strained, a whisper barely audible over the rising shrieks that echoed from all directions. "Greaves, this isn't right. We need to leave. Now." But the words felt hollow, even to him. It was clear they couldn't leave. The ship had become a living thing, its boundaries shifting and changing, and there was nowhere to go. The exit they had once sought was an illusion, a mirage that faded each time they tried to approach it. Now, they stood on the precipice of something far more sinister, a point of no return. The crystal, suspended above the pool of glowing liquid, seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. As they stared at it, the voices grew louder, more distinct. Some of them sounded familiar, whispers they had heard before, the voices of people they thought they knew. Others were strange, alien, filled with an emotion that was both terrifying and sorrowful. It was as though the crystal was somehow collecting the memories, the fears, the lives of those who had been trapped here before them. Greaves took a step forward, his legs moving of their own accord. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the crystal pulsed like the beat of a heart. Each pulse seemed to grow stronger, filling the room with a growing sense of urgency. It was as though the ship was about to wake up, to reveal its true nature, and they were simply pawns in a game they couldn't understand. "You feel it too, don't you?" Riley whispered, her voice trembling. "The way it's alive? It's like it's watching us, waiting." Greaves nodded, but the truth of her words was too difficult to face. The crystal was not just an object. It was the ship's very heart, its core. It was the source of the ship's power, the thing that had been feeding off of them, manipulating them since the moment they stepped aboard. The realization sent a cold shiver down his spine. As they stood there, frozen in place, the ship seemed to breathe with them. The walls shifted again, and the glow from the crystal intensified. Greaves felt a sudden, overwhelming sensation of weightlessness, as though the very ground beneath them had vanished. He reached out instinctively, grabbing hold of Riley's arm to steady himself. But it wasn't just the ground that was shifting, it was the entire ship. They were no longer on solid footing, no longer in control. The voices, once a background hum, now spoke directly to them. They were clear, distinct, and filled with a sense of desperate urgency. One voice, in particular, pierced through the others. It was a low, rasping whisper that sent a cold thrill up Greaves' spine. "You are too late." Before either of them could react, the ship rumbled violently. The walls groaned as though they were stretching, pulling apart under the pressure. The once stable ship seemed to fold in on itself, collapsing into a state of total chaos. The liquid in the pool began to churn, turning black and thick as the crystal's glow intensified, growing blinding in its intensity. Greaves' heart raced as he realized what was happening. The ship was awakening, and they were caught at its very center. The crystal wasn't just a power source. It was the conduit through which the ship maintained its existence, its hold over all who came aboard. And now, it was feeding off them, using their fear, their despair to grow stronger. Riley cried out as the ship's vibrations became unbearable, her hands clutching Greaves' arm for support. The force of the ship's energy was so great that it felt like the very air was being sucked out of the room, as though they were on the edge of some cosmic void. The voices around them turned to screams of agony, now a chorus of tortured souls. "Greaves, what do we do?" Riley's words were frantic, barely intelligible. She was trembling, her entire body shaking under the weight of the ship's presence. But Greaves had no answer. He could barely think, his mind clouded by the overwhelming sensation of being pulled into the ship. It was as though the boundaries between reality and nightmare were blurring. They were no longer merely passengers. They were part of the ship's story now, integral pieces in whatever grotesque, cosmic plan it had set in motion. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the crystal began to crack. The sound was deafening, like the tearing of fabric, like the rending of the very fabric of the universe. The ship's heartbeat accelerated, and the walls trembled as the crack spread, running like lightning across the surface of the crystal. Greaves felt an indescribable pull, as if the very essence of the ship were reaching out to consume them both. The room seemed to warp, distort, and stretch as the crystal split open, revealing what lay within. An ancient, malevolent presence, far older than anything they could comprehend. The ship had finally revealed its true form, and it was more horrifying than anything they had imagined. The air grew thick with an unbearable tension. As the crystal shattered and its jagged pieces fell into the swirling liquid, the entire room seemed to pulse with energy, as though it had drawn a deep, foreboding breath. The ship's innermost core, long hidden from their understanding, had been revealed, and its presence was more ominous than any fear they had previously known. The once flickering lights flickered no longer, and the whispers that had been a distant hum now grew into a roar, a cacophony that reverberated through their very souls. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It had become an entity, a creature alive with an ancient hunger. The walls, once solid and unyielding, now seemed to flex and contract, like the skin of some monstrous beast. It felt as though the room itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling with an unnatural rhythm, the very structure of the ship shifting beneath them. They were trapped inside its organic, living body, caught in the heart of a machine that was more than just mechanical. Greaves staggered back, his legs weak beneath him. He couldn't fathom the enormity of what was happening. It was as if the ship itself had awakened from a centuries-long slumber, and in doing so, had reclaimed its dominance over them. Riley, equally shaken, grabbed his arm, her grip tight with fear, but there was no comfort in it. Nothing could provide solace now. They were utterly at the mercy of the ship, its ancient intelligence weaving through the very fabric of their thoughts. "You feel it, don't you?" Riley whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like it's inside my head, speaking to me. It's not just a ship. It's something alive, Greaves. Something terrible." Greaves nodded, his throat dry. His own mind was no longer his own. The ship's thoughts seemed to leak into his consciousness, wrapping around his thoughts like a suffocating vine. Memories, once clear and separate, now bled together. Faces of people he had never met flickered through his mind. Voices he didn't recognize calling out in torment. And through it all, there was a darkness, a pervasive feeling of decay and despair that threatened to drown him. The crystal's energy surged again, and Greaves could feel it pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. It was as though it was reaching out, pulling on something deep inside of him, drawing forth his deepest fears and regrets. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until he could no longer distinguish them from his own thoughts. They were one and the same. From the corner of his vision, Greaves saw the once clear path they had taken to enter the chamber begin to distort. The walls seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways, folding in on themselves. No matter how much he tried to move toward the exit, it slipped further and further away, as though the very layout of the ship had been rewritten to keep them inside. They were no longer simply trapped. They were contained, kept within the belly of something far greater than themselves. In that moment, a cold realization settled over Greaves. This was not just about survival. It was about something far more insidious. The ship, in its awakening, had decided that it was no longer interested in merely capturing them. It wanted something more. It wanted them to become part of it, to merge with it, to feed its hunger for existence. The realization was like a blow to the chest, and for a moment, Greaves struggled to breathe. "What is it, Greaves?" Riley's voice broke through his thoughts. She was staring at the crystal, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do now? It's like it's calling to us. It wants us, doesn't it?" Greaves didn't respond immediately. The ship's voice, once a whisper, now resonated deeply within him, like a low hum reverberating through his bones. He couldn't understand the language, but he understood the meaning: submission. The ship demanded their surrender. And deep down, Greaves knew that this wasn't a choice. It was a matter of being consumed or being destroyed. They had come too close to the heart of this thing to ever leave it. The floor beneath them began to shift again, slowly, inexorably. The very ground seemed to pull away, as though they were sinking into the ship itself. Panic rose in Greaves's chest, and he tried to fight it, but the pull was too strong. He grabbed Riley, pulling her with him as they moved in what seemed to be the direction of the exit. But the ship was moving faster than they could, its intelligence outpacing their understanding. "No! No!" Riley screamed, her voice ragged. "We can't escape. Can we?" For a fleeting moment, Greaves thought about how much they had underestimated the true nature of the Bermuda Triangle. It wasn't just a place where ships disappeared or where strange phenomena occurred. It was a place where the fabric of reality itself had been torn. And the ship, this creature, was not bound by the rules of time or space. It existed outside of them, and its influence stretched across realities. The walls of the chamber began to disintegrate, not in the conventional sense, but in a more sinister way. They seemed to dissolve, melting into the same black liquid that had been pooling beneath the crystal. The liquid began to spread, seeping across the floor like oil, dark and oppressive, its tendrils reaching toward them. It was the very essence of the ship, its life force, and it was consuming everything it touched. Greaves tried to focus, to make sense of the chaos, but his mind was overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The ship was too old, too powerful, and they were just two insignificant pieces in its grand design. And yet, in the face of such overwhelming despair, a spark of defiance ignited within him. "We won't give in," he said, his voice firm despite the fear that gripped him. "We're not going to let it win." Riley looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. But there was something in her gaze that shifted, a hint of determination, the same spark of defiance that burned in him. Together, they stepped forward, even as the ship closed in around them, and the very air seemed to hum with the ship's awareness. They didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since they entered the Bermuda Triangle, they fought back. They would not allow this to be their end. The heart of the ship pulsed around them, its influence an ever-tightening vice that constricted both their bodies and minds. As Greaves and Riley pushed forward, the weight of their defiance grew heavier with every step. The whispers that filled the air had shifted, no longer mere murmurs, but now a symphony of voices crying out in agony and despair. The ship was no longer a passive observer. It was aware, deeply, viscerally aware of their rebellion. It would not let them leave without extracting a toll. The once stable floor beneath their feet now felt alive, shifting and warping as though the ship itself was altering its structure to prevent them from advancing. It became a battle not just of physical strength, but of willpower. Each step Greaves took felt like wading through thick, invisible fog, his limbs heavier than before. The ship was fighting back, throwing its full force against them. But they pressed on, refusing to be cowed by its omnipresent grip. "Do you feel it?" Riley's voice was barely audible over the increasing din of the whispers. "It's like it knows our every thought. Every hesitation is punished by something." Her words trailed off as the ship's energy surged, rattling their bones and forcing them to slow. Greaves didn't answer immediately. He could feel the ship's awareness, its consciousness, pulling at the corners of his mind. The oppressive hum of its intelligence seemed to burrow deeper with every passing moment, dragging his thoughts into a vortex of fear and doubt. There was no escaping the sense that they were not only inside the ship, but were slowly becoming part of it, an extension of its vast, unknowable power. It was a crushing realization. The ship wasn't just a trap, it was a predator. It didn't just want to imprison them. It wanted to consume them, to break them down until there was nothing left but fragments of their minds, lost in the labyrinth of its existence. They had no choice but to endure, to fight against the overwhelming tide of despair and darkness that sought to drown them. The walls around them grew darker, the once gleaming metal now corroded, tarnished by centuries of age and neglect. The liquid beneath their feet spread, creeping up the sides of the walls, climbing with a sentient determination. It felt as if the ship were alive, its tendrils seeking them out, wrapping around their ankles, trying to pull them into the inky abyss below. Greaves fought to free himself, but the more he struggled, the stronger the pull became. The ship was feeding on his resistance, growing stronger with every ounce of defiance. "We can't keep doing this," Riley gasped, her breath labored. "We're not strong enough." Greaves felt his own resolve start to crack. He could feel the weight of Riley's words deep within him, the very core of his being recognizing the truth. They were exhausted, mentally and physically drained. The ship's power was too vast, its hold too absolute. No matter how hard they tried to push forward, the ship would always bend and reshape itself to block their escape. It was not a simple mechanical structure they were dealing with. It was a being that had endured for centuries, shaped by forces far beyond their comprehension. Despite this, the ember of defiance inside him refused to die. He had seen what this ship could do to those who let it break them, to those who succumbed to its will. The whispers, the agonizing cries of the lost, they were once people. People who had believed they could escape, who had fought against the inevitable and failed. Greaves tightened his grip on Riley's arm. "We can't give in. Not now. Not after everything we've seen." Riley nodded weakly, but the doubt was evident in her eyes. It was hard to ignore the overwhelming sense that they were doomed. The ship's pulse, like the heartbeat of a leviathan, reverberated in their chests. It wanted them to give up, to acknowledge its power, to submit to its existence. Every instinct screamed at them to do just that, to let go and accept their fate. But that was not an option, not while there was still a shred of possibility, no matter how faint, that they could escape. As they struggled forward, the ship's walls began to twist again, this time in a new, more violent fashion. It felt like the entire ship was alive, like the living creature it had now become was seeking to trap them within its own flesh. The walls writhed and twisted like veins under the skin, pulling them deeper into its heart. The black liquid churned around their feet, rising steadily, a ravenous tide. There was no longer an exit. It was as though the ship itself had devoured their route, leaving them with no way out. In that moment, something unexpected happened. Greaves stumbled, his foot caught in the liquid. He fought to free himself, but the ship's force was too strong. And then, before he could comprehend it, he saw something he couldn't believe. A vision. The minds of the ship's previous victims. Their faces, their desperate eyes. They were all here. In the walls, in the liquid, in the very air around him. Their agony lingered in every corner. Their spirits trapped, forced to exist within the ship for eternity. The weight of their suffering seemed oppressing on him, and he knew then that the ship didn't just absorb them. It consumed their very essence, their souls, dragging them into the ship's eternal void. Riley, too, seemed to see it. Her face went pale as she grasped the enormity of what was happening. It's feeding on us, all of us. Her voice cracked. It's been doing this for centuries. Greaves felt the horror settle into his chest like ice, freezing his heart. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for their souls, for the very essence of who they were. The ship was not simply a prison. It was a graveyard, and they were its latest victims, soon to become another whisper in the endless, eternal sea of despair. In the bowels of the ship, the oppressive darkness grew ever deeper. Greaves and Riley stumbled through the twisting corridors, their bodies frail from exhaustion, their minds barely hanging onto their last vestiges of clarity. The liquid that seemed to cover every surface no longer felt like water. It had taken on a more sinister quality, clinging to their skin, seeping into their clothes, suffocating their very essence. They were no longer in a mere vessel. They were in a living entity, one whose needs were far beyond their comprehension. Riley's breathing was shallow, strained, as she struggled to keep her footing. The whispers, the voices of the long-forgotten souls who had once walked the ship's corridors, pressed in from every direction, their suffering palpable. It was as though the very walls were saturated with grief and rage, a fury that grew stronger with every step they took. It wasn't just the ship they had to fight anymore. It was the collective will of the lost souls that demanded their surrender. "I don't know how much longer I can take this," Riley murmured, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and despair. "Every step feels like it's dragging me further into the darkness. How do we even fight something like this?" Greaves didn't have an answer. He couldn't even begin to grasp the enormity of what they were up against. The ship, the Bermuda Triangle, it was all part of something far greater than their understanding. The ship wasn't just a physical structure. It was a force of nature, an ancient presence that had outlasted civilizations, feeding on the very souls that had once dared to challenge it. Its power had grown so immense that it had become a law unto itself, and Greaves felt the weight of that realization settling in his chest like a cold, suffocating weight. But even in the face of such overwhelming odds, there was still a spark within him, a desperate, lingering hope that refused to be extinguished. They had survived this long. They had made it through the chaos and horror, and despite the odds, they still had a chance to escape. But it wouldn't come without sacrifice. The ship demanded a price, and whether they were willing to pay it or not, it would extract its due. As they reached the ship's core, the very heart of its existence, Greaves and Riley were confronted by a chilling sight. The walls here were not like the others. They were smooth, polished, and faintly glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The liquid that had once been a nuisance was now a deep, black pool, bubbling and writhing as though something beneath the surface was stirring. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of power, and in the center of the chamber there was a pulsating mass, something alive, something that had no place in the realm of the living. "This is it," Greaves whispered, though he had no idea how he knew. The ship's heartbeat reverberated around them, louder and more insistent than ever before. It was a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with their own, as though the ship had now fully claimed them. "We're at the center of it all." Riley took a tentative step forward, her face pale but determined. "What do we do now? How do we stop it?" Greaves' gaze never left the pulsating mass. It was alive, yes, but it was also something far older, something ancient and powerful. He could feel its consciousness, reaching out to them, testing their resolve. The ship was offering them something, control, a chance to become part of its vast, endless will. It was tempting, so deeply tempting. A part of him, weary and beaten, wanted to give in, to join the ship and end the madness, to cease struggling against the inevitable. But he knew, deep down, that giving in would mean their souls would be lost forever, consumed by the ship's endless hunger. "No," Greaves muttered, clenching his fists. "We don't give in." But it wasn't just the ship that had to be defeated. It was the very idea of defeat, the very concept that the ship could take them so completely. The longer they stayed here, the more they could feel the temptation to surrender, to give up the fight and join the ship. And that was its true power, the ability to corrupt their will, to make them believe that resistance was futile. A flash of memory hit Greaves. He remembered the faces of those who had come before them, those whose desperate cries had echoed through the ship's halls. They had resisted once, but now they were part of the ship's pulse, its rhythm, its heartbeat. The ship had devoured them, not physically, but spiritually, mentally. It didn't just consume bodies, it devoured hopes, dreams, and willpower. Those who fought against it slowly lost their ability to stand, to resist, to be themselves. Riley's voice broke through his thoughts. "Greaves, look!" He turned to her, following her gaze to the center of the chamber. The pulsating mass had shifted. What had once seemed like a mere aberration had now taken a more distinct shape. Human forms, their outlines blurry but unmistakable. Faces, hundreds of them, floating within the mass, their eyes wide and lost, their mouths frozen in eternal screams. These were the lost souls, the victims of the ship, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. They were no longer individuals. They had become one with the ship, their consciousness fused with its vast, infinite presence. "It's too late for them," Riley whispered, her voice barely audible. "And it will be too late for us if we don't leave." But Greaves didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his mind focused on one thing: the heartbeat of the ship. He could feel it, thrumming in his chest, faster now, as if the ship recognized his defiance. The ship wanted him to stop, wanted him to acknowledge its control, but Greaves pushed forward, forcing his way past the whispers, past the temptation, past the faces of the lost. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The ship's power, its will, was strong, but not invincible. The ship had taken so much from so many, but it had never encountered a force like his will. It had consumed the souls of the weak, those who had faltered, but Greaves would not falter. He would not be consumed. "We'll never let you have us," he said aloud, his voice trembling but resolute. "Not now. Not ever." The ship shuddered, its pulse faltering as if in response to his words. The mass of faces wavered, their screams growing louder, but Greaves stood his ground, Riley by his side. The ship was no longer just a prison, it was a living, breathing entity that could be fought. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to break free, to escape the Bermuda Triangle's deadly grip. And as the walls trembled, as the very heart of the ship began to beat faster and faster, Greaves realized something. The reckoning had only just begun. The ship trembled underfoot, and the very air around them seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. Greaves and Riley stood together, their backs pressed against the cold, pulsating walls of the ship's core, as the oppressive weight of its presence seemed to close in on them from all sides. The voices had become deafening now, each whisper a cacophony of lost souls, their tormented cries growing louder with every passing second. They were no longer just whispers in the dark. They were a chorus, an all-consuming symphony of agony, the very soul of the ship reaching out to engulf them. In that moment, it felt as though the Bermuda Triangle itself had become a living entity, an overwhelming force that had lured them here to feed, to consume. This was no longer just a cursed vessel. It was a manifestation of something far older, something deeply ingrained in the fabric of the world itself. The very laws of reality seemed to bend and warp under its influence, as though the ship was a nexus, a point where time, space, and life itself converged into a singular, unfathomable void. Riley was trembling, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Greaves," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise. We can't fight this. It's too powerful." Greaves stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. He had been beaten, exhausted, broken at times, but there was still a fire within him, a sense of defiance that refused to be extinguished. This was it. This was the moment they had fought for, the one where they had to make a choice. They could succumb to the ship, let it take them like it had taken so many before them, or they could make a final stand. It wasn't just their survival at stake now. It was the survival of everything that had ever been taken by the Triangle's grasp. "You're right," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "It's powerful, but we are stronger. We're not like them. We haven't given up yet, and we never will." The words rang through the chamber, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the ship paused, as though it too was listening. The pulsing mass in the center of the room flickered, the glowing faces of the lost souls distorting in a terrifying, agonizing dance. Their eyes, once vacant, now seemed to stare directly at Greaves and Riley. The ship, the entity that had swallowed so many lives, was no longer merely a vessel. It had become aware of them, aware of their resistance. It understood that they were different, that they weren't like the others who had been too weak, too broken to fight back. And yet, the ship did not retreat. Instead, it fought back with a new level of aggression. The walls shook violently, and the air itself seemed to warp and crack. The ship was angry now, enraged at the challenge to its power. It retaliated by pulling at their very essence, trying to drag them into the abyss. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, and from the fissures, dark tendrils of shadow emerged, slithering towards them like serpents, eager to consume them whole. Riley stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't survive this. It's going to destroy us." Greaves reached out to steady her, but there was no time to offer comfort. The shadows were too close now, their grip tightening with every second. But just as they seemed about to be swallowed by the void, Greaves felt something, an immense surge of energy coursing through him, pulling him forward. It wasn't just his own will now. There was something else, something older and more powerful, coursing through the veins of the ship. It was as though the very triangle itself was shifting, realigning its forces, and in that shifting, something new was being born. Greaves did not understand it fully, but he felt it. The key to their escape lay in this convergence. The ship was not invincible. It had its weaknesses, its flaws. Every force, no matter how ancient, had an Achilles heel. And now, in this moment, he understood that the ship's true power lay not in its physical form, but in its connection to the Bermuda Triangle itself. It was tied to the fabric of reality, yes, but it was also vulnerable to that same reality. It had survived for so long because it had fed on the souls of the lost, but it had never encountered someone with the strength to fight back in the way they could. Greaves looked at Riley, her expression one of terror, but also determination. She had always been the pragmatic one, the one who looked for logic in the chaos. But now, in this moment, they had transcended the need for logic. They had to fight with everything they had, everything they were. With a deep breath, Greaves reached out toward the core of the ship, the pulsating mass of faces and shadows. He didn't understand the full scope of what he was doing, but he knew this was their only chance. He focused every ounce of what he had left into his hand, willing the mass to recoil, to withdraw. The ship responded, slowly, at first, as though it were testing his resolve. The faces of the lost souls flickered, their screams muffled by an unseen force, but the mass did not relent. And then, something strange happened. A single face, more distinct than the others, appeared in the mass. It was a face Greaves recognized, his own. It stared back at him, its eyes filled with sorrow and rage. This was no illusion. It was as though the ship had somehow manifested his deepest fear. The fear of losing himself, of becoming just another part of the Triangle's endless hunger. Riley gasped beside him. "Greaves, don't..." But it was already too late. The ship had anticipated this, and now it was drawing him in, trying to swallow him whole. The tendrils of shadow wrapped around his legs, pulling him down. But Greaves gritted his teeth. He would not be consumed. He couldn't allow himself to be just another lost soul. "Riley," he gasped, his voice strained. "Now do it. Finish it." Riley, understanding his intent, stepped forward. Her hands found the control mechanism hidden within the ship's core, the last piece of the puzzle. With a final push, she activated it, and the ship screamed, a sound so terrible it shook the very fabric of their reality. And then, everything went silent. The silence was overwhelming. It was not the silence of peace, nor the stillness of safety. It was the oppressive, heavy silence of something that had ceased to exist. Greaves and Riley stood in the aftermath, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds struggling to process what had just transpired. The ship, the entity, the curse, it was all gone, dispersed into nothingness, as though it had never been. But it had been. It had all been real. The horrors, the whispers, the souls. It had all been part of the Triangle's grip on this world, a grip that had now been loosened. And yet, there was a lingering question that would forever haunt them. What had they truly escaped? Had they defeated the Triangle, or merely disturbed something far darker and more insidious? They stood on the deck of the ship, the once foreboding hull, now eerily still, like a forgotten monument adrift in the vast, empty ocean. The water around them was calm, unnaturally so, as though the very sea had been drained of its life force, leaving only the quiet expanse of nothingness. The sky, too, was different. The thick, oppressive clouds that had surrounded them since the beginning had dissipated, revealing a sky that was impossibly clear, devoid of the usual chaos that seemed to rule the Bermuda Triangle. Riley was the first to speak, her voice a hushed whisper. "Is it over? Are we free?" Greaves didn't have an answer. He stared out at the ocean, his eyes scanning the horizon. Everything about this moment felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. He had spent so many days, so many hours, trying to break free of the Triangle's curse, but now that it was gone, he wasn't sure what to feel. Had they truly won, or had they simply become the next chapter in the Triangle's never-ending story? The absence of the entity left a void, but the void didn't feel like peace. It felt like an open wound. "We escaped," Greaves finally said, though his voice was uncertain. "But I don't know what we escaped to." They were survivors, yes. But in surviving, had they truly conquered the evil that had haunted the Triangle for centuries? Or had they only postponed the inevitable? The Triangle, after all, had been here long before them, and it would be here long after. The world would never fully understand the power that had been contained within its vast, uncharted waters. The myths and legends, the disappearances and strange occurrences, these were all remnants of something far older than anyone could comprehend. Greaves turned to look at Riley, her face tired but resolute. She was still grappling with the enormity of what they had done, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. Perhaps that was the one thing they had gained from their time here. The realization that they were not invincible, not all-powerful, but that together they had found something even more important: resolve. In the end, it was that resolve that had allowed them to defy the impossible. But as they stood there, gazing at the ocean that stretched endlessly before them, Greaves couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too calm, too unnatural. He had grown accustomed to the ever-present tension of the Triangle, the oppressive weight of its mysteries. But now there was only an eerie absence, a feeling that something was watching them, waiting. And then it hit him, the unsettling realization that the Triangle was not just a place, but a force that could never truly be destroyed. It could be suppressed, diverted, or perhaps even lulled into a false sense of calm, but it would never be gone. Riley must have sensed it too, for she stepped closer to him, her eyes scanning the water as though waiting for something to emerge. "What now?" she asked softly. "We're free, but what's left for us? What do we do now?" Greaves had no answer for her. The world they had returned to was no longer the same. Even though the Triangle was gone, its influence had left its mark on them. The nightmares would linger. The memories of the ship, the lost souls, and the horrors they had witnessed would haunt them in ways they could never fully escape. Perhaps that was the real curse. that no one who had encountered the Bermuda Triangle could ever truly leave it behind. It would follow them in their dreams, in their thoughts, in the silence between words. They had survived, but they had also been forever changed. He glanced at the horizon one last time, as if searching for some sign, some clue to the mystery that still lingered in the deep. And then, as though responding to his unspoken question, a shadow passed across the water, a fleeting glimpse of something large and unseen, moving beneath the surface. Greaves's heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the unmistakable shape of a massive vessel, its silhouette fading into the mist. "Greaves," Riley whispered, a note of fear creeping in her voice. "Did you see that?" He didn't answer. The shadow had disappeared as quickly as it had come, but its presence remained, and the feeling that they had not escaped, that the triangle was still watching, was impossible to shake. The ocean, with all its beauty and mystery, was still a dangerous and unpredictable force. And just as the ship had once been swallowed by the triangle, so too could the triangle swallow them again. There was a finality in the air, but it was a different kind of finality, one born of uncertainty. They had lived through the horrors of the Bermuda Triangle, but had they truly survived? Or had they simply become part of its endless cycle, like so many others before them? The answer, Greaves realized, was something they might never fully understand. Perhaps there was no true escape, no final victory. Perhaps the only thing they could do now was move forward, living with the knowledge that the triangle would always remain a part of them, lurking just beyond the horizon. As they turned to leave the ship behind, the ocean before them remained still, the quiet expanse of water offering no answers, only more questions. The triangle might have been gone, but its legacy would never fade. And in that silence, that vast and empty silence, Greaves and Riley realized that the Bermuda Triangle had not been defeated. It had merely shifted, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. And so, the story of the triangle would continue, just as it always had.